bells ring, are you listening? In the lane, snow is glistening. A beautiful sight, we're happy tonight, walking in a winter wonderland.
Hello, bonjour, good afternoon, good morning. This is LaRee Walters-Boadway, and
hi everyone, this is Poonam Patel.
We're from the Safe Center of Peel, and we are currently engaged in a pilot project with the support of the Department of Justice to develop a child and youth advocacy center. The Safe Center of Peel is located in Peel Region, Brampton, Ontario, which is about 40 minutes outside of Toronto. So today we're here to share with you highlights of the report that was released by the Department of Justice in November 2015, entitled Evidence Supporting National Guidelines for Canada's Child Advocacy Centres. We started with a little winter wonderland as we imagine across the country. You're all having your own experiences of what winter looks like. And at times we're going to pause for a moment amidst guidelines. At times these are very exciting, but going through 10 of them can be a little dry, and we are going to ask some riddles, and in the right hand side of your screen you can join and let us know what your answers are to some of the riddles. Also feel free to let us know where you're logging in from across the country. We're very excited about speaking with you today, and part of the beauty about the Child and Youth Advocacy Center model is that we're not only collaborating regionally, but we're collaborating provincially, and in the case of this work, federally. So let's get started with some of the material. So as we mentioned, we are going to be talking about some of the highlights of the evidence supporting national guidelines for Canada's Child Advocacy Centre. It's a large report that was sent to you by the Department of Justice and LaRee. It's 91 pages long, and we'll be hitting just a few pieces as we go along. And we're going to encourage you to keep questions until the end, but throughout, as we're going through the guidelines, we know that many of you are already enacting these in your sites across the country. And so if you wanted to write in and say where you're writing from, so for example, British Columbia or Alberta or out in Nova Scotia, and provide an example of how you are rolling out this particular recommendation, that would be really great. And Signe White, who's with us, who is the Training Assistant and Resource Coordinator at Boost in Toronto, will be reading out your responses, so then we can make it as interactive as possible. Okay. So a little bit of history, and some of you already know this, but for those of you who don't, we know and who are newer to the project, in 2010, the Department of Justice Canada, through the Victims Fund, provided funding for the creation and enhancement of CACs, Child and Youth Advocacy Centers, or Child Advocacy Centers. So we might interchange between those two ways of describing the project. In the Safe Center of Peel, we refer to it as a child CYAC. So I suspect that that's the language that we'll be leaning on most, but also want to recognize that others just choose to use the term CACs. And the Department of Justice also began to build a knowledge base on CACs, and also, internally with their expertise in their research department, also branching out and relying on the expertise and support of many of us provincially and across the country, and also by engaging consulting experts. And then in 2012, additional resources were provided for the budget for CACs. The Department of Justice chairs the national network of CACs, and often LaRee is one of our facilitators for that call. And I don't know about you, but I find those calls really exciting, particularly when we do the roll call and we hear who is on the line from all across the country, different time zones, as many of you are today logged in for the webinar. There's the National Children's Alliance in the United States. Those guidelines that they use for their CAC accreditation process were adapted by the Ontario network of CYACs together with Boost, who took the lead on that, and with support of the Ontario CYAC network. And that happened in 2014. Then in December 2014, a federal working group and steering committee was established to look at the foundational guideline recommendations that were provided by Ontario and Boost. Guidelines from Ontario were used to inform the federal working group, and then the working group, together with Department of Justice, engaged the Canadian Research Institute for Law and Family to build evidence to support the proposed guidelines. They were contracted by the department, which has provided coordination to the working group, to undertake research on the evidence base supporting the proposed new guidelines for Canadian child advocacy centers. So when the goals of the federal working group, as they sought to develop the guidelines, was to promote consistency across the country, to ensure that the Canadian guidelines reflect how child abuse cases are addressed in Canada as compared to the United States. As we know, there is quite a different landscape, sometimes similarities, but a lot of differences that are important to note. Also to assist new organizations as they work towards establishing a child and youth advocacy center, and ensure that the integrity or the foundation of the model is retained. The working group includes representatives from 15 CACs across the country, and members of the committee include, but are not limited to, the Sheldon Kennedy Centre in Calgary, Boost in Toronto, Department of Justice Canada, and KPMG Consulting. With the National Children's Alliance, the creation of their standards began in 1996, and they engaged in this exercise for the purpose of accreditation of all CACs. And talking with Pearl Reimer today from Boost, who also helped to lead the development of the Ontario guidelines, she reminded us that really this is the beginning foundation of what we'll be utilizing over time, most likely in Canada, to develop our own accreditation process for child and youth advocacy centers. So the National Children's Association created these standards through a process of evidence collection and research, just like we have engaged in here in Canada. And they combined essential components, which were mandatory, and also rated criteria, which were non-mandatory. So suggestions and those that were absolutely essential. NCA reviews and revises these standards every 5 to 6 years, and they have recently revised the standards, and those are going to be released in January 2017, and the rated criteria or the non-mandatory criteria have been removed. So for the Canadian working group purpose and objectives, we wanted to review the national and international research to provide the evidence, background, and context to empirically support the rationale for each of the 10 proposed Canadian guidelines, which we will together be providing highlights of. These guidelines will provide a framework to CACs as they are established and developed. It is important to note, however, and we will repeat this again, that these guidelines are intended to be aspirational for child advocacy centers and represent the gold standard supported by the research literature. It is recognized that achievement of all 10 guidelines may not be possible for all CACs, but the guidelines essentially will only provide directions to CACs at this point as they are established and developed. And there is no current mechanism currently in place in Canada to accredit CACs. So the methodology that the working group used, the research questions to guide the project, we'll be going through those in a moment. But as we mentioned before, and we know this already from the support of the Department of Justice, they've already collected a considerable amount of information relevant to this project, and this work was shared with the Institute. We relied on the work of Boost and the Ontario Group and the National Children's Alliance, and the Ontario Guidelines provided the foundation for a working group's March 2015 visioning session. So a large group came together both in Toronto and Calgary as well at the Sheldon Kennedy Centre. So the first question that guided the project is, what social science and legal evidence is there that support each of the 10 proposed guidelines? Number 2, where evidence does not support a proposed guideline, what would the contractor recommend in terms of wording, content, so that a guideline does reflect current evidence? Number 3, what are the key differences between the NCA US standards and what is being proposed for Canada? What are the differences between the criminal justice and child protection systems in Canada and the US that necessitate different wording or content in the guidelines? And as many of us have developed CYACs, CACs, or can have them developed, you've probably all encountered that question around, yes, we have lots of evidence from the US, but how is Canada different? Or we want to see evidence from Canada, not from the US. So we have been working really hard in many of our regions to develop that evidence to be able to answer that question. Research question number 4, have other countries established standard guidelines documents for their CAC-like services, and would these be relevant? And finally, is there evidence for any new guidelines that are not currently included that were recommended from the Ontario Group and Boost? If so, what is it, and how would that guideline be framed? For example, there's been some discussion amongst the working group members about guidelines relating to addressing vicarious trauma, secondary traumatization, burnout among CAC staff and partners. There was also some discussion about a guideline regarding privacy and information sharing. So the next slide is very familiar to you, and we won't go into it in detail, but these are the National Children's Alliance current standards listed in front of you that were published in 2010. And as we mentioned, there'll be new guidelines, revised guidelines that will be out in January 2017. The Canadian proposed and recommended guidelines are listed in front of you, and Poonam and I will be going in more detail through each of them, but they're not significantly different when I look at the two, would you say,
yeah,
Poonam?
They're not too different.
Yeah.
Some of the wording, but we'll point that out as we go along.
So child-focused setting, multidisciplinary team, cultural sensitivity, forensic interviews, advocacy and support services, and for the State Center of Appeal, and we call our advocate a navigator. So we might choose to use a little bit of that in sort of, advocacy, navigation, and support services. Medical evaluation and treatment, mental health evaluation and treatment, case review, case tracking, organizational capacity. So before we get into the guidelines, let's take a little Winterland break.
Here to stay is the new bird. He sings a love song.
So anybody on the line, or Poonam or Signe, can guess, where does a snowman keep his money or her money? Anybody? Let's see if there's any responses coming from across the country.
Any guesses?
And Signe is watching for responses.
Walking in a winter wonderland.
Come on, Alberta, you must know this. Nova Scotia, Manitoba, Cheryl, if you're on the line.
Dave Wolf said in a snowbank.
In a snowbank, and where's Dave from? We know which province? So Dave. In a snowbank, yes.
Awesome. He's from Alberta.
Alberta, see, we know.
Shout out to Alberta.
And I think they're covered in snow right now. Yeah, in parts. Okay, thank you. Handing it over to Poonam.
So for the next 10 guidelines, LaRee and I are going to be alternating and talking about each one in a little bit more detail. As she had mentioned just a little while ago, that at the Safe Center of Peel with our CYAC program, in terms of the advocacy and support services, we often go by using the term of navigational support or a navigator. So that's also my role at the CYAP, and I might be using some of that language interchangeably while I talk about some of the guidelines. So the first recommended guideline in the report is the CAC CYAC provides services to children, youth, and their supporting family members in a safe, neutral, and comfortable child-friendly setting. And what the research has found in terms of the rationale to support this guideline is that a child-focused setting helps alleviate fear and anxiety throughout not only the investigation process and prosecution, but also throughout that family's entire life cycle at the CAC. And it greatly also can contribute to their involvement in the entire process. In terms of how this can be achieved, research had found several things in terms of what components can complement the guideline. And that research was comprised of feedback from Child Protective Services, police officers, law enforcement, members from the MDT, also known as a multidisciplinary team, and families themselves who utilize CACs throughout the country. So some of the main things that were found in terms of how and why child-focused settings can be friendlier is for them to be private, informal, free of distractions, and appropriate in terms of needs and abilities, as well as psychologically and physically safe. Back about 20-odd years ago, feedback was received from law enforcement officers as well as Child Protective Services that interviews, when they were taking place at some of their own offices, at schools of the children or at the children's homes, respectively, some of the feedback they received was that they were frightening for children and families. They lacked privacy, and usually, especially if the interviews were at the homes, the interviews were compromised. So with that, with having a child-focused setting within the CACs, the focus there is about is in terms of the waiting room and also the interview spaces, for them to be free of distractions and also welcoming for the families in terms of decor that recognizes different cultures and appropriate in terms of age and ability of activities. I had mentioned physical and psychological safety as well. And what I mean by that and what's been found in the research is that there's a couple things to consider when you think about safety. So one of the examples was, and something that we also pay special attention to at the Safe Center of Peel, because we have a lot of partners on site, is to ensure that there's a separation and a divide between children, their non-offending caregivers or family members, and offenders. So this is especially something to consider if the CAC shares a space with an agency that provides services to offenders, such as partner abuse programs or counseling for the offenders as well. And ways to address this is to include it in the policies and procedures for the CACs, and have suggestions on what can be done. So for instance, seeing the family members on different floors or even on different days. And that also alludes to that open communication with the staff and the families who are involved in coordinating appointments for the families and also for the offenders. Another aspect in terms of safety, physical safety and psychological safety, is for all staff, so CAC staff as well as members on the MDT, to maintain confidentiality and privacy at all times. So this is within their own team to ensure that they're protecting the confidentiality of all families they're working with, to discuss cases in a private space, so that other families are not privy to information, and to also be vocal about what the confidentiality and privacy policies are with the families, especially when they do first come to the CAC. Another piece of safety is to ensure supervision for the children and youth who are at the center, as well as for their family members, and to ensure that is to include volunteers, staff, again, whether it's CAC staff or MDTs, to always be with the children and to have them in sight and hearing distance at all times. Some of the examples from the research indicated that children can have problematic behaviors, or they may react or be triggered by something, especially at a time when they're just about to or have gone through an investigation. So that supervision is key to support all the families at the center who are there. Research also had found, and there's probably many of you who can relate to this, is that while most CACs are independent centers, so it may be a little bit more easier to focus on creating a child-focused setting, some CACs are also based out of larger organizations or institutions, such as at a prosecutor's office or in a hospital. Typically in these, what research has found, it might also be a little bit different based on the development of CACs, is that they usually will have their own wing or their own entrance. It's also important to include in situations like this, where CACs are in larger organizations, to still focus on creating a child-focused setting, which can be done in various different ways throughout the center. So that would be with the first guideline.
Excellent. And from a number of us have had the privilege to visit a number of different centers in our provinces and across the country, and have seen how beautifully most of us are adopting these child-focused settings, and how creative we each have got in terms of where we're located to do the best we can. It's really at the foundation of the work.
Yeah, it really is. It doesn't have to be a large space to have it be child-focused. It could even be in a hallway where they're walking to the interview room. That can be comforting for the child and family, and it could be in the room themselves that they're waiting in. So different ways to be creative, for sure.
And if there's any unique examples that you want to share of how that is being enacted in your community or where you visited, please type in your answers, and we'll provide some examples of that at the end or throughout. So the next is the multidisciplinary team, and the recommended guideline based upon the research is that the CAC or CYAC will include an integrated multidisciplinary team from the core disciplines and agencies involved in the case, usually police, child protection services, medical and mental health assessment and treatment, prosecution, and advocacy and support. So the research literature supports the inclusion of this guideline regarding the use of a multidisciplinary team for suspected cases of child abuse. In a suggested reworking of the Ontario guideline that was proposed, the federal working group proposed replacing the term multidisciplinary team with integrated team. While it is certainly important that a team dedicated to investigating abuse and providing services to abused children is integrated, that we're working together, that there's a seamlessness of services, the term multidisciplinary is universally used in the literature globally and should be retained within the Canada's guideline. And so some of Ontario's recommendations about who should be part of the multidisciplinary team, we know that it varies widely depending on the region. So for example, at the Safe Centre of Peel, where almost 50% of our residents identify as being born outside of Canada, settlement services are a really key piece, for example, of our multidisciplinary team. The Ontario recommendations minimally say police, child protection services, medical services, mental health, advocacy for child, youth, and family, Crown Attorney, and prosecution. And in addition to core partners, MDTs can expand to include other professionals. And in some communities, we also know that many members can wear multiple hats, depending on where you're located, depending on resources. So for example, we know in Ontario with one of our small projects, our smaller communities is that, sometimes our executive director will easily flip into being an advocate and, vice versa. However, we, recommend that an interagency agreement clearly commits also signed parties to its MDT child abuse intervention response, and that people are clear about what each of those roles may mean, even if they're going and flipping from hat to hat. Medical professionals are a key piece and are able to consult about the advisability of a specialized medical evaluation and the interpretation of medical findings and reports. And mental health professionals can provide the MDT with valuable information with respect to the child's emotional and psychological state. Inclusion of this group as part of the MDT ensures assessment and treatment are more routinely offered. And the purpose of MDT involvement in intervention is so informed decision-making occurs at all stages of the case, so children and families benefit from a coordinated response. So additional research evidence is that the research does support the benefits of using an MDT approach to manage cases of alleged child abuse. And in the traditional approach, there may be poor integration of services, which can result in multiple interviews of the child with multiple interviewers and little interagency coordination. We've found through the literature that it enhances child safety, there's less falling through the cracks, there's a reduction in information gaps, more effective and efficient decisions, more timely case resolution, higher professional satisfaction in doing the work together. I know at the Safe Center of Peel, prior to doing the work in this model, we would all individually be going off to our weekends and, feeling, some of us described sleepless nights, worrying about Monday and the victim. And there's something different about knowing that there's a whole safety net, a group of you taking care of that family that feels different when you're away from the center. Greater coordination of services positively related to higher conviction rates, corroboration of victims' evidence, perpetrator confession, and criminal charges. One piece of research found that prosecution of cases was significantly related to the number of members on an MDT. As the number of team members increased, so did the likelihood of prosecution. And almost half received medical exams in CACs compared to 12% of traditional cases, which is quite significant. And we also know that in the CYAC model, when you have a multidisciplinary team that includes mental health professionals, that on average there's a 30% increase in referrals and uptake to those kinds of supportive services. We also know that it's not easy, right? Living together and working together, chances are part of why we've not been able to do it as well, and but as we're starting to do it now, is that it's hard. And some of the barriers are conflicting theories and ideologies about child abuse and neglect, lack of consensus, turf disputes, agency territorialism and power struggles, confusion about leadership roles and ownership of the case, feelings of excessive case scrutiny and interdisciplinary decision-making can be more time-consuming in traditional approaches. We do recognize that it is very hard, but also how we structure our organizations and the leadership and the champions that we have within these models really help us to mitigate and work through these difficulties.
Absolutely. So the next guideline is cultural sensitivity. Cultural competent and socially exclusive services are available to all children, youth, and their families and caregivers at the CACs. So the rationale that supports this is that cultural sensitivity and inclusion influences the entire process. Again, the entire life cycle of that family at the CAC. So that begins from welcoming them at the center to employing effective forensic interview techniques, gathering information, connecting to appropriate mental health providers, and also securing any other supports for the family. Large part of this entire process involves proactive planning about the case. So in that, research recommends that there should be, what should be taken into consideration in terms of cultural sensitivity, and to really come from a family-centered, child-focused approach is to include considerations for the diversity of cultures, ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status, disability/ability, gender, and sexual orientation, to be able to positively influence the family's engagement in the center. Research about cultural sensitivity was quite interesting in the sense that it included some of the problems that were found in CACs when there wasn't enough cultural sensitivity provided, and why it should also be included within the life cycle for a family at the CAC. So for instance, some of the research has found that racialized children display a more complex pattern of symptoms and more lasting negative effects than Caucasian children. And that kind of leads into the components that are recommended in terms of being sensitive, being accommodating in terms of language and cultural considerations and service provisions for diverse children and youth. To discuss specifically what these provisions mean, we can talk a lot about language and communication in terms of for provisions to be made for non-English speaking, deaf, or the hearing impaired for children and youth, as well as for their family members. What's key here, and we find this at the SAFE Center a lot because we work in a very diverse region, and so looking at communication and language barriers is one of the first things that we do when we come into contact with the family, is to see if they need an interpreter, or even if they need appropriate documentation in their mother language, in their mother tongue. So that leads into translation services as well. What is highly recommended, and again, at the SAFE Center we support it as well, is to always include interpreters in the service provision rather than relying on family members. Even if they're adamant to be interpreters, it's to have a third party to interpret a lot of the nitty-gritty details of the case are imperative in order to move forward for the case, as well as for the family to understand what is really happening, and to increase that transparency between the MDT and the family involved. Language barriers can, as mentioned, can impact the ability to obtain information and hinder the ability for the MDT to convey their details. As well, it can already compound barriers between the child and youth with their non-offending caregivers. So if there's already a communication block, which, for example, at the SAFE Center with our CYP, we do find sometimes that the parents or the non-offending caregivers, their English-speaking skills may not be as strong than their children. So we do want to mitigate that barrier as much as possible and address it very quickly. Similar to what I had described in the child-focused setting is to be culturally sensitive, materials in the CAC should reflect different ages and developmental stages, ethnicities, religions, and genders in order for the families to feel more welcome throughout the center. So you see that overlap and you'll continue to see overlaps within the guidelines as well as we continue to discuss them. One of the main pieces in the research that was found about cultural sensitivity, which goes a little bit beyond the physical aspect, and in terms of service provision, is for MDT staff and CAC staff to really develop an understanding, if they don't have it already, of that child and family's background. And what I mean by that, and described in the literature, is their perception of abuse and their comprehension of Canadian laws especially in comparison to if they've been exposed to other laws in other countries. Their religious or cultural beliefs that may impact disclosure, and their prior experience with police or law enforcement authorities in other countries or in their country of origin. These can vary and really impact the interview, the disclosure, as well as any further support for the family. In addition to those components, what's also recommended is for the CAC, depending on where it's located, is to recruit, hire, and retain staff, volunteers, and board members. So essentially people through different levels of supervision, is to reflect the demographics as well as an understanding of the community that it is in. And that may involve training, that may involve just larger discussions, or a continual aspect of checking in to see what are some of the issues, what are some of the changes in the demographics that we're seeing in the community, and how can we respond. I can give you an example. At the Faith Center of Peel, like I mentioned, we work in a very diverse community, and on site itself, we have 12 different languages that are spoken within scope, as well as just staff coming from a variety of different experiences and how they can inform some of the decision maker, even the initiatives that we have. So there's quite a lot to take in terms of cultural sensitivity, but it's also a growing area in terms of the researcher that was also identified.
And very, very important as Canada in our multiple regions continues to work towards healing and support of our Aboriginal communities. There's lots of examples of that across the country and how we're trying to do that within our own CYACs. What do you think, Poonam? Do you think it's time just for a brief Winterland Wonderland break?
I think so.
Yeah?
Just a bit of a break.
Okay. So get ready for the latest joke, and please write in your responses.
So, what do you call a snowman in the summer?
Which province do we think is going to get this one? Maybe BC?
So rainier, maybe BC. Maybe BC. It's a little bit more rain on that side.
Any answers?
Just gave it a hint.
Any responses? Is this a hard one?
Not yet.
Not yet. So the question is, or the riddle is, what do you call a snowman in the summer? What's the answer?
And the answer is a puddle. Get it? Melts.
Okay, so for the next joke, it might not be as tricky as that one. Good, so let's move on to the next standard. So forensic interviews. After the research was completed with the working group, the federal working group, and our contracted experts, the recommended guideline for forensic interviews is that they're conducted in a manner that is legally sound, of a neutral, fact-finding nature, follows leading practices, and are conducted jointly by police and child protection services to avoid duplicative interviewing. With the Ontario recommendations, as you know, were used as a foundation for the federal guidelines. They talked about developing formal protocols that describe the steps involved in the investigative and interview process. They also recommended that forensic interviewers have formal specialized training to conduct CYAC interviews, that the CYAC provide an interview environment that enhances free recall, minimizes interview influence, and gathers info needed to avoid duplication of the interview process. They also recommended that interviews should be conducted at the CYAC wherever possible in that comfortable, child-focused setting. The CYAC is where the multidisciplinary team is best equipped also to meet the child and the family's needs during an interview phase. If interviews take place outside of the CYAC, however, steps must be taken to utilize appropriate forensic interview guidelines. And forensic interviewers should receive ongoing specialized training in order to keep their skills most relevant. So the research evidence behind this guideline is that one of the primary goals we know of CACs is to improve child forensic interviewing following allegations of child abuse. We really want to do a good job, and some of our police partners will say to get the bad people off the street. And this is really important that we have this really tight process around forensic interviewing. In a mid-project report that the Department of Justice helped to move forward on the impact of Canada's CACs, they reported that in 80% of cases, children had forensic interviews, and in 81% of cases, only one interview was conducted, which is really quite phenomenal, as one of our goals has been to reduce the number of interviews. Children having one forensic interview by trained interview with an MDT observing or member of the MDT observing reduces interview duplication. And everybody's getting the same information at the same time and doing the work behind the scenes and then coming prepared when they're face-to-face with the family. Also, research evidence has found that CACs have notable impacts on the investigation and the forensic interviewing. Team interviews, videotaping of the investigation, joint police and child protection and police involvement in the CAS cases are more common. And use of structured forensic interviewing protocol by trained interviewer leads to more arrests, charges, and higher convictions. And the research that the Department of Justice engaged in, doing a poll of what we're currently doing across the country, found that the majority of Canadian CIACs use the stepwise interview technique, and one CAC in the sample that they questioned uses the RATAC or RATIC protocol.
So the next guideline that I'll be discussing is advocacy and support services. Defined as victim advocacy and support services are neutral and available to all children, youth, and families at the CYAC. Advocacy and support are offered to help reduce trauma for the child or youth and supporting family members and to improve outcomes. So the rationale to support this, again, similar to the other guidelines that we spoke about, is that this is important throughout the entire time the family is engaged with the CAC. And similar to the MDT, it's one of the core components of the CYAC model. And one of the undertones that I found in the research and literature identified in the report is that a large part of this guideline is about education and the ongoing support being critical in child and family's comfort and ability to participate in the intervention and treatment, which I'll go into in a bit more detail shortly. In terms of, so before I tell you what you're seeing on the slide right now, I'll talk to you about the components a little bit more in terms of the advocacy and support services. So I had described earlier that I'm the child and youth navigator, similar to what many of you may be more familiar by calling the role as an advocate. Other common terms are used to describe them are being a liaison, or someone who refers victims and family members, someone who provides updates, or being a listening ear and a central point of contact. So just from those terms, it kind of gives an idea of the capacity that this guideline can have. And similar to what LaRee had described when discussing the MDT, is oftentimes with advocacy and support services, or with the advocate or navigator, is this role may be split. For instance, being an advocate as well as a counselor, which was described in previous webinars as well. And what's important for that when there are roles that are split is to also be clear in policies and procedures with CAC staff and the MDT, is the clarity on what these roles entail and also the boundaries involved in it. So some of the components that are identified is the advocate ensures consistent and comprehensive networks of support and navigating through the system's response to that child or youth case. So this includes, but is definitely not limited to, crisis intervention and support at all stages, attendance and coordination of interviews as well as regular case reviews, orientation to the CAC, education about the MDT, providing updates to the family, and assisting with services such as housing, food, transportation, providing referrals for mental health services, and the very big one identified is helping to prepare for court or being a support person in the criminal justice system. Within the literature, clients and families have also advised that it's helpful for them to be informed of their rights as victims of crime as well as victim compensation. And that's something that is included in the advocacy and support services. In terms of the ongoing education that I had mentioned earlier, what research found in terms of a gap with advocacy and support services that were identified by MDT staff as well as families involved with the CAC was for that consistent education for them to understand the dynamics of their case, the impact that aspects of the case can have on their children and how they can best respond to it, and how the supports that they're being connected to can be beneficial. So making referrals is just as important as sharing why these are important to the family. So they have clarity on what to expect and an understanding of what it is for. I can give an example that at the beginning of their involvement with the CAC during the police investigation and the interview, it may be very clear to them of what is being investigated. However, if they are then going to be receiving medical support, there could be much more details that may not be in full understanding for them. So there's an importance to have more education for the advocate themselves to be able to explain, or at least have a medical professional to be able to explain what all the actions that they're doing mean for the family. And last, to kind of wrap up this guideline, is advocacy and support services, because it is ongoing for the family throughout their life cycle at the CAC, means that there's constant assessment needed in order to, case dynamics can change, as well as families can be triggered at any point or begin to respond in different ways to the case. So advocacy and support services, it's there to respond to these needs as they arise, and to be able to connect or even change a bit of the pathway of where that case was going in order to respond timely and appropriately as well. I think we're going on to a little break. Who across the country would know
about what the gingerbread man put on his bed. What did the gingerbread man put on his bed? This one's new to Poonam. Any guesses? Type your answers in. What did the gingerbread put on his bed? So the gingerbread man put a cookie sheet.
I wonder if anyone got that.
And let's move on to medical evaluation. So the recommended guidelines, specialized medical evaluation and treatment services are routinely made available to all children and youth and are coordinated with the multidisciplinary team response. All cases of suspected child abuse shall be assessed by a health professional to determine the need for a medical evaluation. Medical evaluation holds an important place in the MDT assessment of child abuse. Some of the goals of the medical evaluation is to reassure children and youth and their caregivers about their well-being, identify and document necessary medical findings, screen for injuries, medical conditions, and initiate treatment when necessary. Ontario recommendations, they put forward initially that medical evaluation should be offered to all children and youth, and all medical clinicians who provide medical evaluations at CACs should have adequate training and ongoing education. Right now in the region of Peel, we send the majority of our physical abuse cases to Toronto, and we have capacity for sexual abuse treatment in Peel. Yeah. Right. Relevant findings of the medical evaluation should be shared with and explained to the MDT in a routine and timely manner so that the case decisions can be made effectively. So this recommended guideline, when they delved into the literature, the research supports the need for CAC clients to have access to medical evaluations and for medical personnel to have specialized training. Medical exams identify medical evidence that could be used in criminal proceedings, identifies injuries and commence treatment as needed, and reassures the victim and caregivers regarding the child's physical well-being. And suspected victims of sexual abuse are twice as likely to receive medical exams at CACs as opposed to response as usual. Primary care pediatricians, we have found, generally have little experience to evaluate cases of child abuse. Medical personnel at CACs would have specialized training. In one study found that, and this is quite notable, that hospital-based CACs provided better assessments of abuse-related risk factors and abuse experience and management of the immediate sexual health needs of teens. In another study, it discussed the necessity of obtaining a complete medical history from sexually abused children in addition to a physical exam. In addition to the necessary medical information, this process can also be therapeutic for the child and family because it can serve as an opportunity to address any worries or fears they may have regarding the next processes and the examination.
So stemming from that is the next guideline, mental health evaluation and treatment, which is comprehensive trauma-informed counseling and mental health services designed to meet the unique needs of children, youth, and their family members, and are essential to the multidisciplinary team response. So the common focus of the MDT is to minimize potential trauma to children. Without effective therapeutic intervention, many traumatized children will or can suffer ongoing or long-term adverse social, emotional, and developmental outcomes. So the components identified here to mitigate the risk of that happening include counseling and mental health services provided by staff who have an expertise in child abuse and child development. And this kind of leads into to include specialized trauma-focused mental health services for children and youth. What research has found is, and it focused quite a lot on trauma-focused CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, because there's quite a bit of empirical evidence to support the treatments and assessments that can reduce the impact of trauma and risk of future abuse. But there was limited research to identify that these mental health services were offered by the majority of CACs. So that was a bit of, those were some inconsistencies that were found, but also recommendations then on how to establish protocols and procedures within the CYACs, for instance, to conduct appropriate mental health screening, to train mental health professionals on the MDT to be able to do this and eventually lead to a better understanding and to meet the needs of children and families. One of the other main components identified is to include a trained mental health professional in the case reviews, so that someone who can have that informed perspective in terms of that child or youth's mental health, and to also monitor that child's mental health throughout their involvement with the CAC. As mentioned earlier, that the case dynamics can change, which means that that child's response can also change. One of the main themes identified in the research, which I think is really important to consider, is that mental health treatment is separate from gathering evidence. So while a lot of the other components, such as forensic interviewing, is about gathering evidence, mental health is not. It's more so of a clinical process that, again, is designed to assess and mitigate those possible negative impacts that I had mentioned earlier. And lastly, for mental health support, I mentioned the child and youth quite a bit, but their non-offending caregivers and family members are just as important, and just as important to be screened as well to address their emotional impact of the allegations of abuse, to reduce risk to them, and address any issues that can impact their support for the child's recovery. What was noted a couple of times in the research is sometimes the non-offending caregivers or family members, they can be triggered, and their own history of victimization or any trauma at all could surface through their own child's experience. And this can also be addressed from their mental health professional and should be identified in the policies and procedures at CYACs in order to move forward with the actual application of it.
Right. And we've already seen that at the Safe Center appeal and in amongst our, just the beginning of our short pilot, which began in April, how much support we're providing to the caregivers who've had their own experiences of trauma and mental health.
Yeah, exactly.
And even in the case of some offending caregivers, being able to connect them with services as well. Okay, so only 3 more to go. And case review, case tracking, and organizational capacity. So case review, the recommended guideline is that a case review is an essential process that supports the information sharing and decision making with respect to the investigation, case status, and services needed by the child and youth and family, and should occur at least once per month. And participation in this will include all members of the MDT. Ontario recommended that case reviews are intended to monitor current cases and are not meant as retrospective case studies, although you can do both. And at the Safe Center appeal, we are doing both, and quarterly we're looking at retrospective case studies in order to look at a systems response, systems improvement at the larger level. And this is a formal process by which knowledge, experience, and expertise in the current case situation of the MDT members is shared so that informed decisions can be made, collaborative efforts are nurtured, formal and informal communication is promoted, mutual support is provided, and protocols procedures are reviewed. encourages mutual accountability, ensures child needs are met sensitively, effectively, and timely. Each CYAC from Ontario group recommended that we must have a process to review cases. Essential information and professional expertise are required from all disciplines to make informed case decisions, and all team members address their specific case interventions, questions, and outcomes. Case reviews include multiple elements of reviewing interview outcomes, medical exams, disclosure, planning and monitoring, emotional support and treatment needs, provisions for court, etc. Have a designated person to lead the case review, organize and facilitate the case review meeting. So the research evidence, the research literature does support this guideline again. One article described case review as a process during which members of the MDT regularly convene to discuss the family's well-being. Team members become acquainted with each other in case process, retain their own agency's mandate while also learning about others involved, prevent cases from falling through the cracks, enables the ability to identify gaps in resources and conflicts in service provision. Effectiveness is influenced by co-location. So we find in the literature found that if you're co-located, then case reviews are happening more often. There's greater frequency, and team leader and member interactions are really important, and the lead coordinator organizer is really important, that they're very skilled in being able to facilitate. In the report that was provided by the Department of Justice, they noted one piece of literature from 2011, Smith, and Smith identified 3 essential concepts to optimize team member and team leader interactions: a sense of trust by both team leaders and team members in each other and the case review process, that shared goals will be achieved, respect for members and leaders as demonstrated by acceptance of each other's differences and beliefs, perceptions and experiences, and acknowledgement that team goals will be achieved through collaborative efforts, and commitment to working as a multidisciplinary team and holding each other accountable for their level of engagement in the case review process in the CYAC model. Okay.
Okay, so it's joke time. If a reindeer lost his tail, where would it go for a new one?
That's a tricky one.
Well, part of the answer is in the question. So, another hint.
Another hint. So part of the
Sarah said retail.
Oh,
yes.
Which province is Sarah from?
Nunavut.
Nunavut. Yes, go to retail. Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Oh, goodness.
Okay, so going on to the second last guideline, case tracking. So case tracking refers to a systematic method where specific data are routinely collected on each case served by the CYAC. CYACs must develop and implement a system for monitoring case progress and tracking case outcomes for all multidisciplinary team components. So the rationale for this is that a case tracking system provides that essential demographic and case information, investigation or intervention outcomes, and can be used for a variety of different things, including on the case level for MDTs, as well as for program evaluation, such as quality improvement, ongoing case progress, and monitoring outcomes to create various reports, so statistical reports, funding reports, annual reports and so forth. So some of the components identified is that each CYAC can determine its own type of case tracking system, especially because some of their policies and procedures will differ from CYAC to CYAC. Just one of the main consistencies identified is that they are compliant with privacy and confidentiality requirements, because at some point or another you would be sharing some of the data beyond the MDT, to members beyond the MDT. And the research has shown how effective case tracking is beneficial on different levels. So for instance, on the child and youth or family level, CYACs who collect and retrieve case-specific data for all their clients, again, is linked to demographic information, their type of abuse, relationship to the offender, the MDT involvement, charges laid, child protection outcomes, medical and mental health referrals or information, and any other services. As this information stays up to date with all members of the MDT and the case dynamics change, that family can be updated with the precise information. And that leads into how it's beneficial for MDT members. With that expectation, and also something to include in policies and procedures for CYACs, is that MDT should be submitting their data thoroughly and timely. Why is this beneficial for them? Is that they will then have access to each other's data, and that can inform their plan or their next steps forward with the family or with their own interventions. And on a wider level, across CACs, nationally and provincially, and regionally, when data is collected across centers, it can be used to assemble local, regional, provincial or territorial and national statistics, which, I think the report that we've been referring to, as well as work before that, is a good example to indicate how data collected informs further decisions or establishments within the CYAC model. And one of the main aspects, because case tracking is quite detailed and it involves a lot of accuracy and can be quite time-consuming, is to, again, similar to other members in the MDT, is to really identify who this role would be for and what their boundaries are, as well as are there resources to have a designated person for case tracking, or is this going to be a shared role, and what those responsibilities mean for that role, as well as for the MDT and CAC in general. So, would be case tracking.
Case tracking. So our final guideline, organizational capacity. So the recommended guideline from the federal working group is that every CAC or CYAC must have a designated legal entity responsible for the governance of its operations. And the role of this entity is to overseeing ongoing business practices of the CAC, including setting and implementing administrative policies, hiring and managing personnel, providing training and support to personnel, obtaining funding, supervising program and fiscal operations, and long-term planning. And as we know, for those of us who are playing this role within the CACs, it is a big job to do, and they're doing it very well. Some of the guidelines that Ontario recommended is that the CYAC has a defined organizational identity that ensures appropriate legal and fiduciary governance and organizational oversight, and that every CYAC must provide appropriate insurance for the protection of the organization and its personnel. So CYACs should consult with appropriate risk management professionals to determine appropriate types of insurance and any additional levels of coverage needed, such as renters, property owners, and automobile insurance. Every CYAC should have written policies and procedures that govern its administrative operations, and we know across the country we've been sharing those with one another. Don't reinvent the wheel. Borrow, beg, borrow, and steal. This amazing work that's been done on policies and procedures, and for many of us, that's not our favorite thing to write. Confidence in the integrity of the fiscal operations of the CYAC is critical to the long-term sustainability of the organization. And an annual independent audit is one tool to assess for fiscal soundness and internal controls for financial management. And a financial review is sufficient for CYACs with annual expenses equal to or less than $500,000. So again, these are just recommendations that we're coming forward. In order that children and youth receive the services they require, CYACs should have personnel responsible for coordinating its operations and programs and services, and the CYAC should have sufficient staffing to support all program components. Efforts must be made to secure reliable and ongoing sources of funding for these positions. And also we want to ensure that there's formal screening processes for staff and volunteers. So the research evidence, I just talked about, Ontario's recommended guidelines, but then when the Canadian Working Group and the experts delved into the literature, they found, not surprisingly, that various forms of governance structures and regulations exist across CACs. There's no best model. We're a very diverse country, and we have diverse CACs. And one of the few consistent structures found across CACs, however, was the use of the multidisciplinary approach. The research literature does support this draft guideline as proposed and does not preclude CACs from being incorporated into or housed within organizations. In a lot of the cases, that's what is happening. In the Proactive Information Services 2015 Mid-Project Report, on understanding the impact of CACs in Canada, the researchers found that all 6 centers included in their study operationalize their objectives in different ways and have varying governance structures. An excellent example that's provided in the report on the bottom of page 58 is that of those 6 groups, this really speaks to the diversity. One is sponsored by a registered charitable society. For example, an agency's volunteer board governs another, but both have their own steering committees. One CAC is a partnership between police and social services, and one operates as a demonstration project within a health center. And one is a governmental collaboration with an agreed upon terms of reference and memorandum of understanding, and the 6th CAC has a board of directors consisting of representatives from the partner agencies as well as 3-member executive committees. All 6 CACs, however, use a multidisciplinary team approach. Again, the research said that there is no single best model for structuring CYACs. And in a US 2000 study, they referenced US CACs, as we know, who have a lot of experience in history, and the National Children's Alliance work. And in this article, stated by Fowler and Paluski, 2007, they said, although the National Children's Alliance has attempted to set standards and hence achieve uniformity amongst CACs, perhaps uniformity should not be an overriding goal. Indeed, research on community and program development suggests that organizations that are developed from the ground up rather than from the top down are more viable. Yeah, we also find that there's more engagement. A movement that comes from the bottom up is way more successful than the top down. Finally, as in one of the guidelines, we talked about the inclusion of the health of staff and vicarious trauma. In this guideline, under organizational capacity, it does have a couple of pages related to this. And from what we understand, and they haven't been released yet, I'm sure you'll all have them on your bedside stands starting in January when they're released from the NCA, the new standards, is that in the revised standards, the NCA has added 2 essential components to its organizational capacity standards, and that's related to the health of its employees and is intended to reduce employee burnout and improve employee retention. And it states that the CAC promotes employee well-being by providing training information regarding the effects of vicarious trauma, providing techniques for building resiliency to its employees, and maintaining organizational and supervisory strategies to address vicarious trauma and its impact on staff. The second essential component recognizes the important role that CACs have in strengthening the functioning of the MDT. It also recognizes that the health of the MDT can directly impact service delivery. Thus, addressing the issue can ultimately improve outcomes for children and families. It states the CAC promotes MDT well-being by providing access to training and information on vicarious trauma and building resiliency in its MDT members. In its mid-project report on understanding the impacts of CACs in Canada, the Proactive Information Services unfortunately found that very little formalized training and support was available to help MDT members in Canada to cope with the realities of the job. Rather, the only formal supports available to MDTs were employee assistance plans available through their employer. One site did offer train-the-trainer support on compassion fatigue to the victim advocate, but had yet not been offered to other team members. And please note that that was only just a representative of 6 CACs. We know that we do have a lot more work to do in this area in order to maintain the health of our employees, and that has been being recognized across the provinces and territories and across the country. So before we take questions, our last winter wonderland joke. So we got a surprise that our territories are on the line as well. So which territory or province can answer this joke?
So where do snowmen go to dance?
Where do snowmen go to dance? Signy's waiting for your response. Where do they go to dance?
The snowball.
Woo! That was quick. Where is that from?
Chio.
Where?
Chio.
Chio? And what province or
Ottawa.
territory? Ottawa! Excellent. The snowball. Good stuff. Yeah, so thank you everybody for humoring us today and also listening to the highlights of the guidelines. And now is the opportunity for questions or comments. And even provide examples on how you're doing some of this work already in your region, province, territory. If you know a good winter joke, you can also type that in, and Signy will share it with us.
What was the publication you said would be released soon?
The publication that will be released soon is the National Children's Alliance Revised Guidelines.
And are there any specific trainings that you would recommend for advocates?
The NCA on their web portal for training have a series of different trainings. I've accessed them on their website. They're pretty user-friendly, and there's a lot of specific topics in terms of working in an MDT, some trauma-informed trainings, just kind of thinking off the top of my head. So there's a variety of them. I forgot what the actual website is, but if you search up NCA web portal for training, there's a registration
link.
A link.
And they're all webinar-based. You can access at any time with your slippers on, you know, or by the fire. They're free as well. Yes, and they're very specific to this work. You and one of our other navigators attended the June National Children's Association Leadership Conference in Washington. Although they fit for leaders in the NCA, CYAC movement as advocates, did you find it helpful?
Yes, it is. It's very helpful, even like as a member on the MDT or as an advocate or navigator. It's the timer. Sorry. Because they have, for this one, and I think the past ones are arranged this way as well, is that they have different workshops that you can go to. And so we picked ones that were based on the needs that we see at the SAFE Center in the region of Peel, but they also had it for other parts nationally and what they see most. And there was a focus on human trafficking, so more workshops on that. So definitely a good opportunity for training and also to network and to see what else is being done at other CACs, whether they're just kicking things off the ground or whether they've been there for quite a while.
And it's a great question. In Ontario, we've been attempting to get all of our advocates together to be able to provide them with support and to actually begin to identify what are some of the training needs. And perhaps that's a really good proposal that we put forward to the Department of Justice, either the federal network or in one of our provinces or territories, is to develop a Canadian training for advocates.
So 2 more questions here. One is, do you have an email that you can be reached at if there are any additional questions later on?
Absolutely.
Yes. It's not on the PowerPoint, but yes, absolutely, we can.
And I can include that in the email.
Perfect.
The next question is, during your research, has there been any notice on how to measure / document cultural sensitivity? How is it documented if a CAC is meeting their standards?
Can you repeat the first part of that question again?
Has there been any notice on how to measure and document cultural sensitivity?
So right now, Ontario is just in the end stages of developing our province-wide evaluation approach that will be piloted starting in January across a number of sites. And in that evaluation survey that's provided to caregivers, there's at least 1 question or 2 questions related to cultural sensitivity. At the SAFE Center of Peel, prior to this pilot, we also asked questions related that you were, around client satisfaction, related to were you served in a manner that was sensitive to your culture, race, language, sexual orientation. So it is an important piece, and we watch that really carefully when we receive our the summary of our quarterly evaluations to ensure that that is happening within our center. If you're interested in what the email, if you'd like to know what those couple of questions are on our evaluation, either with the Ontario pilot or the SAFE Center Appeal, we'd be happy to share them with you.
Would it be possible for you to email your list of sources that you used for this presentation?
I'm wondering if Signe could provide the link to the report that the Department of Justice provided, as that all of the literature and research that was noted today was directly from that report, and all of the sources are listed in the back of it. Would that be helpful? Hoping.
Perfect. Okay. I think that's it for questions. So.
Great. Okay. So should we end with one last joke about how does a snowman get to work? How does a snowman get to work? No guesses?
Bicycle. That was a little tricky.
That was a little tricky. So happy winter to everybody, and those who will be logging into this webinar in the spring as it's recorded and will be made available will understand that there's a seasonal context to today's jokes. Thank you for all that you do.
Yeah, thank you very much for tuning in on a Friday afternoon.
And thank you to Stickney and Boost Toronto for hosting us today for this webinar.
Okay.